Today on CityCast Houston, some high-profile Republicans on the national stage have openly endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. But is this trend happening here with the local GOP? Conservative commentator Charles Blain joins me to talk about if there's an identity crisis brewing in the Harris County Republican Party and the MAGA movement. Plus, we get his insider's take on the Republican strategy for races down the ballot. It's Monday, September 30th. I'm Raheel Ramzanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. Hey, Charles. Happy Monday, man. How are you?
I'm doing good. It was a great weekend, and I'm glad to be here. Hopefully, it's a great week. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to talk with you. But before we jump into this conversation that we have planned, I want to ask you, is it pronounced MAGA or MAGA? Because as we were preparing for this conversation, my executive producer and we got into like a little debate about this. Like, how do you pronounce it? How do you pronounce it?
That's a good question. I think when I say it, it's MAGA, but I've honestly heard people say it both ways. Even people who identify as kind of MAGA Republicans have said it both ways. So I think it's fair to pick either, depending on how you're feeling that day.
Yeah, tomato, right? Same thing.
Right,
It's all good. We know what you're saying. Hey, obviously Texas is still considered very much a red state, right? But what is it like being a Republican in a city led by Democrats?
I mean, it's an uphill battle. I think with a lot of my Republican colleagues, they focus largely on the state level because it's easy. You can get wins there. And what their fights are fights that are inter-party. They're fighting each other. They're fighting policy, whether it's more conservative, less conservative. Whereas the stuff that I look at is more on a Democrat versus Republican angle. However, because I'm looking at local issues, it doesn't really fall into the partisan lens as much. So it's very different than I think what a lot of my friends and colleagues are doing at the state and the national level. But it's fun nonetheless.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that Democrat versus Republican battle, right? That's always happening. And we recently saw high-profile career Republicans like former Vice President Dick Cheney and his daughter, former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, publicly endorse the Democratic presidential nominee and Vice President Kamala Harris. Are you seeing that trend here locally with the Harris County GOP where old school Republicans are splitting from the party or at least on the presidential ticket because of former president and GOP nominee Donald Trump?
No, I honestly have not seen it at the local level as much as we've seen some of these more national figures. And I think that goes to the kind of intra-party fighting that I was mentioning before, that there is kind of a tug of war in the party of which side is going to win, whether it's kind of that new age MAGA populist movement or if it's going to be that old school, Republican movement that had long existed. And I think you're seeing a lot of that tug of war, but you don't find it as much at the local level. And I think in a large part, it's because of what I said before, which is that our fights are so different at the local level that even with the top of the ticket being the way that it is, everyone at the local level is like, listen, we've got to have each other's back because we don't have many wins on the board and we need to get more wins. And so let's put all that other stuff aside and work together. And that's not to say there aren't some people who are speaking out and who are maybe opposing the top of the ticket or something like that. But I think by and large, we're not seeing it the way that we're seeing it, that current change at the higher levels.
Let me ask you on a personal level, because you are a conservative commentator and the party is important to you. Do you have any kind of identity crisis going on right now with the Republican Party that you know and the MAGA movement by any chance?
I wouldn't call it an identity crisis. I call it sometimes kind of a frustration on the issues that we focus on. I mean, because, when I wake up, I'm looking at what city council and what commissioners court's doing, and I'm looking at how these tax raises are impacting people's lives and, how people are going to put food on the table and what policies coming out of city council and what that's going to mean for people. Whereas all these other fights that are taking place aren't necessarily fights that I personally care about, nor do I think that the people who are struggling the most among us care about on a regular basis. So I wouldn't call it an identity crisis as much as I'd call it just frustration with where we're putting so much of our intellectual capital and so much of our time. Whereas I think we could be redirecting it and getting wins where it actually matters, which I always say is at the local level. So not an identity crisis, just a crisis of frustration, I think is what I would call it.
And let's talk about policy here because are there policies or platforms that are keeping some of Houston's old school conservatives in the party? Do you think it's long-term GOP issues like abortion and taxes, or do you see some more of that culture wars like book bans driving people to the party now?
I think it's a little bit of both. I do think some of the culture war stuff is driving people to the party now. I mean, I think during the pandemic, when kids were learning at home and parents got to see firsthand some of the stuff that they were learning, it riled up some parents. And I think when you look at some of the local school districts across our region, you do see some conservatives now more engaged in that level than they previously had been. But I also think that traditional issues that we've always talked about, like abortion and crime and taxes, are also motivating a lot of people to stay involved. And I think what we're seeing lately is, rather than people putting themselves in positions of having to argue issues they don't necessarily care about, everybody's just kind of siloing off and doing what they think is the issue that matters most to them. And so you've got these groups over here fighting for the abortion issue, and these groups over here fighting the tax issue, and this group over here doing crime, because that's what's motivating them and that's what's keeping them engaged. And I think the local party, Harris County GOP, does a good job of kind of providing a place for people to pursue those different angles and different areas in the way that they see fit. They have some involvement at the local level. They rally people to go and show up at commissioner's court. They also do legislative priorities. Occasionally, they're engaged at the federal level. So they try to create a place that people can advocate for the issues that they care about without having to kind of adopt everything else if they don't necessarily believe in it or care about it.
With all of that in mind, what do you think are going to be some of the bigger local issues on the ballot this November?
I really think crime. I mean, I think crime is the issue, and it's whether we're talking crime rates or perception of crime and safety or public safety funding. Like, I'm lumping all that into crime, because we've seen locally the fight at the commissioner's court over district attorney funding, and there's been fights over funding for constables, and we've seen the issues with Houston Police Department, the funding there, and complaints about the judicial system. And so I think that is going to be the driving issue for a lot of folks. Some people who live in crime-ridden neighborhoods want those neighborhoods to do better. People whose neighborhoods may not be as burdened by crime don't want them to become burdened by crime, or their perception of the safety of their neighborhood has dropped and they want something to be done there. One of the things that came up a couple weeks ago when Harris County Commissioner's Court was doing their budget was some of the constables talking about how they understand that they're underpaid, and that's not the issue that they're most frustrated about. What they're most frustrated about was that they felt it was a broken criminal justice system, that the work that they were doing wasn't being, I guess, realized in a sense, because of people they were arresting who were then getting back out rather quickly. And I think that issue is motivating a lot of people, whether we're talking about the courthouse or the district attorney's office or any of these other entities, to stay involved. And so, the party, where local Republicans have been really focused on judicial races this cycle. The judicial races have just really been a fire behind a lot of the local activists. And I think it's because a lot of them are motivated by the crime issue.
Charles, crime right now, when it comes to homicides and most violent crimes, are down in Houston and across the nation, right? We've seen the numbers. I want to push back here. Why is this a driving issue?
Well, I think it's a driving issue because people don't feel it. I think that's the thing. We see it in the numbers, but when the average person is assessing crime, they're not looking at what numbers are being reported by HPD or by the sheriff's office or things like that. They're looking at what they're seeing on the nightly news. They're looking at the car break-ins in their neighborhood. They're looking at things like that, and I think people just generally don't feel as safe as they used to. And then couple with that with some of the stories that we hear out of the judicial system, it seems to just really pile on. And so I understand that when Mayor Whitmire took office, he said something and he got a lot of heat for it. It was I'm gonna kind of butcher what he said, but it was like, the numbers on crime don't matter as much as how people feel. And when I first heard it, I was like, I don't know about that. But then when I really thought about it, it does matter how people feel. And a lot of what our local officials do is trying to reassure them that their tax dollars are being spent appropriately, that they're doing everything they can for public safety, that they're advocating for their needs. And sometimes the reality matches the rhetoric and sometimes it doesn't. But I agree that the numbers are reflecting a better swing, but it just seems that some people just don't feel as safe as they used to still.
I want to stick to local issues, and you mentioned district judge races. What are you expecting there? Some listeners who are new to Houston may not realize that district judges are elected in Texas in partisan races, so they're Republican or Democrat. Is the local GOP bracing for a blue wave there, or do you think Trump is going to draw a lot of voters down the ballot for this?
Honestly, with everything right now, I think it's anyone's game. And then I know that it sounds like a cop out answer, but because I was talking to a friend a couple weeks ago and they're like, do you really think that everything's split down the middle? And I'm like, kind of. If you look at some of the previous judicial races, they were separated by like 400 votes out of a million. Like, I mean, I think we're so split down the middle right now. Even city council races, hundreds of votes, if that separate candidates. So I think it's anyone's game. But what I will say is that from what I've seen with the party, they are doing a lot of work at trying to get people to not just understand that they need to vote all the way down the ballot for all these judicial races, because as you know, we have the longest ballot in the world. And
Yes.
but they're also trying to get people to understand what these courts do, who these judicial candidates are, what their records are, what the records of the incumbents are. They're really trying to open that door up because I think for far too long the judicial races have been I don't want to call it a secret, but like you're going in there and you're voting for people you have no idea the basis of them running, how their legal practice was, are they a good candidate or not. And so I think both parties are trying to do a good job, actually, because I've seen the Democrats do it too, of trying to get people to understand that better. And so from the Republican side, I do think that they do have a slight edge because I think people are still concerned about crime. We've been seeing a lot of family members of murder victims outspoken about some of the judges. And when we're looking at particularly some of the Court of Criminal Appeals, which we're voting on as well, those aren't just Harris County. There are our region. And I think when you're looking at some of the numbers of adjacent counties where Republicans might typically perform better, that might balance it out a little bit for some of the Republican Court of Appeal candidates. And so, again, I think it's anyone's game, but I do think the Republicans are doing what they need to be doing to actually win some this year. And for the first time in a long time, they won 4 of them last cycle. They won 4 of the district court races. And so there's a slow comeback. It's taken a while, but, but they seem
Sure.
to be doing better than they have in the past.
Charles, let's talk about the district attorney race because it started with Sean Tier beating the Democrat incumbent Kim Ogg, who then went on to endorse Senator Ted Cruz, but that's a story for another day. But Sean Tier looks to be in a tough battle with another former prosecutor in Dan Simons. How competitive do you see this race being?
I think that's a hard one to say, right? Because I didn't expect the incumbent district attorney to lose. And so if you had asked me then, I would have been wildly off of what I would have expected to
Yeah,
happen. But what I will say with Dan Simon is it seems as though I've not been intimately involved with his campaign, but I've seen it from afar. And he really does seem to be doing a lot of the work necessary, somewhat like 2022 campaign of Alex Mueller, going into communities that don't typically speak to Republicans, trying to get them to understand about the issues that they're running on and why they matter to them. And similarly, I haven't at all been intimately involved with Sean Tier's campaign, but he does seem to be doing a lot of the same. But I think that with the crime issue, with the judicial kind of campaigns, the way that they are, and you have like a full slate of a quote unquote criminal justice ticket from district attorney to sheriff to judicial races, I would say that Dan Simons is probably in the best position of any Republican district attorney candidate in a long time to actually win. And so I would say that if there's a year to do it, it's probably this year.
and I'm glad you brought up the last cycle. What do you think the strategy is for the Harris County Republican Party here in Houston? Because we saw the GOP pour tons of money into Alex Mueller's race against Lena Hidalgo, but she lost. And I heard one party official call it the GOP's last stand in Houston. Do you think there's still a chance for the GOP to win countywide office like with the district attorney's race? Or is the strategy on smaller races like the property appraisal board?
Well, I think the strategy should be both, really. I do think that there's still an opportunity. And this isn't just Harris County GOP. I think Republicans as a whole have long ignored what you just said, kind of those lower level races that actually matter. The party as a whole has largely ignored those and focused on bigger, more premier races. And so I think that has been a shift that we've seen in recent years where they're recognizing that these races are important as well. And so I do think it's both of those. It's focusing on the lower level ones ones, but it's also focusing on the county. Because if you go back to when Judge Ed Emmett was county judge and Devin Anderson was district attorney and Republicans dominated all the countywides, I think at that time Democrats were probably thinking that they had a long road to hoe too, and that they were probably not going to be able to pull this off anytime soon. And then it started with one, and then they got more and more and more, kind of in the same way that Republicans felt under Democratic controlled Texas when they finally won a first statewide. And so I think that pendulum swings back and forth. So I wouldn't write it off completely, but I do think that it takes work as we move forward, and elections aren't as easy as they used to be. We have more diverse coalitions, more people moving to Texas with varied interest. It's going to require getting to know people in a way that we didn't previously, and communicating to them in a way that we didn't previously, if we're actually going to get them to consider voting Republican. And it seems as though the party's doing a lot of that work. Cindy Siegel, the chairwoman, has I don't want to say surprised me, but in terms of Republican outreach, has surprised me with the kind of innovative ways that she's been getting out in the community. They hosted this series called Conversations on Crime, where they were going out to different communities like Pasadena and other places, talking to them and bringing some of the judicial candidates or judges or other people related to public safety, and kind of talking about what that means for their community. And I thought it was a really interesting concept and something that the party hadn't done previously. And so I not writing anything off, but it is certainly an uphill battle, without a doubt.
All right, let's zoom out from the city level and now go to the state level and talk about the Senate race. Senator Ted Cruz has shown a lot of support in the past for Trump, but now has moved to a more centrist messaging. Do you think any of that is going to backfire on him in this race against Colin Allred?
I think with Senator Cruz, he is such a known entity that I think everyone in Texas, I wouldn't say everyone in Texas, I think that's an over generalization, but a lot of people in Texas have a
Yeah.
position on him, whether it's they like him or they don't. It's not like they're trying to find out more to determine if they like him, unless maybe they're someone who has newly moved to Texas. And so I wouldn't say that it would backfire, but I do think that with the changing demographics in Texas, it takes a different kind of campaign and a different type of attitude to really be able to pull it off. And I think that's what we're seeing with Senator Cruz, is really trying to get out there and talk to people in a different way. And also, as much as someone like me, who I don't often buy into the partisan politics of it, I really like to look at the policy side. But there is this common acceptance that during the primary, elected officials and candidates will, obviously be more progressive or be more conservative, and kind of move a little bit to the middle during the general. And so I think we are seeing some of that on both sides. And I think his campaign remembers, 6 years ago when they beat Beto by 2.6, I think. I mean, that's a narrow margin. And so it takes a different kind of campaign to be able to pull that off and to retain what he has built and what he has earned. And so that's what I take that to mean. That's what I look. That's
Yeah.
how I see him kind of viewing this moving into this election.
And one last question about Senator Cruz. Do you listen to his podcast?
I don't. I've heard good things, and then I've also heard criticism, but I have not listened to it. I will. I
Okay.
will.
Yeah, I haven't listened either, but I saw that the podcast is getting a lot of scrutiny on if it violates campaign finance laws. All right, Charles, final question. With the election in November, what do you think the margins are going to be for Trump at the top of the ticket? And the reason I ask is because in the last two presidential races with Trump on the ballot, Texas Republicans still won, but they saw smaller margins, especially in suburban strongholds like Montgomery County, which is just north of Houston. In the last midterm elections, they did regain some ground, but not as much as before Trump. What do you think is going to happen this time around?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And we even saw it in Harris County in some of our House districts that were really close, closer than expected. And I think you naturally have some Republicans who do not like the top of the ticket, and who either vote one way for the top of the ticket and vote different way down ballot, or whatever the case that they may do, but they naturally are turned off by that. And I think we do see that down ballot some. And it's always unfortunate, because these candidates at the lower portion of the ballot, whether they're state house, state senate, judicial races, they're all running different races on different issues and have their own political brands, but they're always tied to the national political brand, and they have to answer for that even if they have nothing to do with it. And so I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. And we're seeing state reps out there now, specifically State Representative Lacey Hall. I know that she's in a it's not necessarily like a 50-50 district, but it's pretty close, like one of the closest evenly split districts for the state house across the state. And so those are the races that I think the Republicans are really paying attention to and attempting to get out there and do more block walking and encouraging people to not just listen to the top of the ticket, but take a look at her record and the work that she's done in the state legislature. And I think on that same note, you have the ability to really touch the voters firsthand, talk to them, get them to understand who you are as a candidate rather than let your opponent paint you one way. So I do hope that with the right amount of work, we'll see those margins a little wider than we saw last time. But I'd be lying if I said it wasn't going to be tough for some of those candidates who are down ballot who are going to have to deal with those headwinds. I mean, it's going to be very tough.
Charles, thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this, and you have a great week too.
That was Charles Blain. He's a conservative commentator and the president of the Urban Reform Institute. You can read his work with the link in our show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, text this to 3 of your friends who are registered to vote so they can learn more about what's happening in our city. You can also get more Houston news and happenings by subscribing to our newsletter, Hey Houston, at houston.citycast.fm. Thanks. That will do it for today. I'm Raheel Ramzanali. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new. I think I called him Paul Simon, so I will retract that later.
Oh, did
I don't know why. Yeah, that was on me. Okay, we'll move on.